The fog that rolled off the Delaware River on those late October nights did not merely drift. It clung to the asphalt of Ridley Township like a damp, heavy shroud. It muted the neon hum of the strip malls, softened the glare of the auto repair bays, and turned the headlights of passing sedans into blurry, sweeping searchlights. It was a Friday evening, the precise kind of autumn night where the air smelled of wet oak leaves, diesel exhaust, and the distant, metallic tang of stadium lights. The local high school football game had wrapped up less than an hour prior, leaving the grandstands empty and casting a vanguard of exhausted, hungry teenagers out into the surrounding avenues. In the farthest corner booth of the Blue Star Diner, 16-year-old Elijah Vance was systematically dismantling a basket of seasoned fries. Elijah was a creature of quiet habits and disciplined rhythms. An honor roll sophomore at Ridley High, the anchor of the varsity 4x100 relay team, and a boy who spent his Saturday mornings cleaning kennels at the county animal shelter, he possessed a calm demeanor that belied the explosive power in his legs. Across from him sat Julian Cross, a lanky kid whose growth spurts had outpaced his coordination, leaving him with a mop of unruly brown curls and an insatiable appetite. "I'm telling you, El," Julian mumbled, around a massive bite of a double bacon cheeseburger, a stray shred of lettuce tumbling onto the wax paper below. "Coach looked right at me during the fourth quarter. Next week, I'm in the starting lineup. I can feel it in my bones." Elijah let out a soft, melodic laugh, dipping a fry into a pool of ketchup with surgical precision. "Julian, you literally tripped over your own track spikes during warm-ups yesterday. The only lineup coach is putting you in is a padded room if you keep running like a newborn deer." "That was a structural issue with the track, not a reflection of my athleticism," Julian countered, though his grin gave him away. The atmosphere inside the Blue Star was a symphony of working-class comfort. It was the rhythmic clatter of heavy ceramic mugs against formica counters, the steady rhythmic hiss of the flat-top grill where onions caramelized in pools of butter, and the low, comforting murmur of old men in flannel shirts discussing the upcoming Eagles game. In the background, an aging jukebox pulsed with the steady bass line of vintage heartland rock. Navigating the narrow, vinyl-lined aisles with the grace of a seasoned mariner was Maeve Reynolds. In her late 50s, with a crown of faded gray hair held back by a pencil and an apron bearing the honorable stains of gravy and black coffee, Maeve was the undisputed matriarch of the establishment. She knew which regulars took their eggs over easy, who was hiding from their wives, and which teenagers actually paid their tips. To her, the Blue Star wasn't just a business. It was a sanctuary where the outside world's sharp edges were temporarily blunted. 12 miles away, rising above the concrete expanse of downtown Philadelphia, the glass and steel towers of the federal complex stood stark against the night sky. On the 8th floor of the FBI field office, entirely detached from the low-stakes banter of the diner, Elijah's father was presiding over a room thick with tension and the smell of stale espresso. Special Agent Garrett Vance was a man defined by gravity. A 22-year veteran of the Bureau, he currently headed the Regional Joint Terrorism Task Force. Standing 6'2", with broad, square shoulders and a face that looked as though it had been chiseled out of Appalachian granite, Garrett commanded a room without ever needing to raise his voice. His eyes, a piercing, observant dark brown, held the terrifying ability to strip a suspect of their defenses in a matter of seconds. He was a man who lived within the strict confines of federal statutes, tactical precision, and an unyielding moral compass. Yet, beneath the tailored charcoal suit and the heavy weight of his gold shield, Garrett was fundamentally a single father navigating the minefield of raising a young black man in an era that rarely afforded second chances. He had given Elijah the talk so many times it had become a solemn liturgy between them. Keep your hands flat and visible. Speak in low, measured tones. Address them as sir or ma'am. Never argue the merits of the stop on the street. Your only objective is to survive the encounter, Elijah. Let me handle the battlefield afterward. Elijah knew the protocol by heart. He had memorized it not out of fear, but out of a profound respect for the man who had raised him alone since his mother passed. Until tonight, those instructions had lived in his mind as an abstract theory, a shield he carried but never expected to unsheathe. Outside the fog-streaked windows of the Blue Star, the gravel of the parking lot crunched under the heavy treading tires of a Ridley Township police cruiser. The black and white Ford Interceptor slid into an unlit space near the dumpster, its engine idling with a low, menacing rumble. Behind the wheel sat Officer Boyd Sterling. Sterling was a 10-year veteran of the township force, a man with a thick, bull-like neck, a closely cropped buzz cut, and a permanent, defensive scowl that seemed etched into his forehead. Throughout his decade on the street, Sterling had earned a reputation among the community's minority residents as a volatile officer, quick to use weight instead of words, eager to demand absolute submission, and deeply insecure in the presence of anyone who didn't immediately cower. Beside him in the passenger seat was Officer Jesse Cole. Cole was a rookie barely 6 months out of the municipal academy. His uniform was still crisp, his leather duty belt lacked the scuffs of experience, and his mind was still filled with the idealized notions of public service, community policing, and constitutional rights. "Dispatch just dropped a notification," Sterling grunted, his thick thumb tapping the mounted terminal on the dashboard. "Commercial alarm down at the convenience store on Kedron Avenue. Shoplifter took off on foot. Suspect is a young black male, dark hoodie, denim jeans, heading north." Cole leaned forward, his brow furrowing as he wiped a patch of condensation from the side window. "Boyd, that's almost 4 blocks away. And that description? Half the kids who just walked away from the high school stadium are wearing dark hoodies and jeans tonight. It's 45 degrees and raining." "Yeah? Well, let's go see who's hiding out in the diner," Sterling said, shifting the cruiser into park with a sharp, metallic click. He unbuckled his seatbelt and adjusted the heavy Glock 22 riding on his hip. "Criminals are predictable, kid. They run a few hundred yards, their adrenaline drops, they get hungry, and they think they can melt into a crowd. Watch and learn." The moment the diner's heavy glass door swung open, causing the brass bell above it to chime, the collective energy in the Blue Star shifted. It was an involuntary, atmospheric reflex. When a uniform enters a room, conversation dips, posture straightens, and the air grows thin. Elijah glanced up casually from his plate, his eyes tracking the 2 officers as they shook the rain from their uniform caps. He was wearing his favorite deep navy track hoodie, the varsity R embroidered subtly on the chest, and a pair of dark, slightly faded jeans. He felt no surge of panic. He had been sitting in this identical booth for the last 50 minutes. He had an empty milkshake glass and a half-eaten basket of fries to prove it. Sterling's gaze swept the room like a radar dish. He bypassed the table of elderly men tracing patterns in their spilled sugar, ignored a young couple sharing a slice of apple pie, and locked onto the back corner booth. His eyes found Elijah. A slow, predatory satisfaction settled across Sterling's features. He extended a heavy arm, tapping Cole hard against the center of his ballistic vest. "Told you, easy pickings, matches dead on." The heavy rhythmic thud of Officer Sterling's duty boots against the black and white checkered linoleum seemed to drown out the jukebox entirely. Elijah felt a cold, instinctual prickle at the base of his neck. The casual warmth of the diner vanished, replaced by the stark, terrifying realization that the trajectory of his night had just been violently altered. The 2 officers stopped directly at the edge of the Formica table, casting a long, dark shadow over the teenager's food. Julian, his mouth half full of burger, looked up with an expression of pure confusion. Can we help you, officers?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly with the awkwardness of youth. Sterling didn't even grant Julian the courtesy of a glance. His focus remained entirely, aggressively fixed on Elijah. "Stand up," Sterling commanded. The voice wasn't an inquiry. It was a low, gravelly rasp, loaded with an immediate promise of violence. Elijah's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird, but his father's training took hold of his limbs like an external anchor. "Keep your hands flat. Speak clearly." Carefully, deliberately, Elijah opened his palms and pressed them flat against the cold formica surface of the table. "Is there a problem, officer?" Elijah asked. He kept his pitch level, his cadence slow, and his tone thoroughly respectful. "I said, stand the hell up," Sterling repeated, stepping closer, his right hand dropping down to rest with unmistakable intent on the grip of his taser. "Hey, wait a minute, we've just been sitting here eating," Julian interjected, dropping his burger onto the plate, his face flushing red. "Shut your mouth, kid, before I drag you out of here for obstruction," Sterling snapped, his voice rising, drawing the eyes of every patron in the establishment. He turned his full, intimidating frame back toward Elijah. "You match the description of a suspect involved in a strong-armed robbery 4 blocks away. I am not going to ask you again. Get out of the booth." "Robbery?" Elijah's eyes widened slightly, but his hands remained frozen, glued to the table. "Sir, I've been right here for nearly an hour. You can ask Ms. Maeve, the manager. I haven't left this table since the game ended." Officer Cole, the rookie, shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his eyes darting toward the counter where Maeve was already setting down her coffee pot, her expression hardening. Boyd," Cole muttered under his breath, leaning in close to his partner. "Maybe we should just get his ID first. Talk to the staff, see if—" "I don't need a rookie telling me how to secure a suspect, Cole," Sterling hissed, his patience evaporating. Without another word of warning, Sterling reached across the table, his thick fingers bunching into the fabric of Elijah's navy hoodie. With a violent, sudden heave, he yanked the 16-year-old completely out of the booth. The sheer force of the movement sent Elijah's empty glassware crashing to the linoleum, the remaining shards of ice and vanilla syrup pooling across the floor. Elijah stumbled, his sneakers losing traction on the wet tiles, but Sterling didn't give him the grace of balance. With a brutal, two-handed shove, the officer propelled the teenager forward, slamming him face first into the stainless steel edge of the adjacent pie counter. A sharp, blinding explosion of pain erupted across Elijah's right cheekbone as his face collided with the metal. "Get your hands off him!" Julian shouted, slamming his fists against the table as he stood up. "Back off! Stay where you are!" Cole yelled, stepping between Julian and his partner, his hand hovering uncertainly over his pepper spray, his chest heaving with a panic that mirrored the room's. "Stop it! Boyd Sterling, what do you think you're doing to that boy?" Maeve shouted, abandoning her station behind the counter and rushing down the aisle, her voice trembling with rage. "Elijah has been sitting in that booth since 7:15. He hasn't moved." "Back away, lady. He's resisting a lawful order," Sterling roared. Elijah was doing nothing of the sort. His mind was screaming, a torrent of adrenaline flooding his system, but the voice of the man who raised him remained louder than the chaos. "Do not fight back. Survive." Elijah could feel the crushing, cold weight of Sterling's forearm pressed directly into the nape of his neck, pinning his face flat against the cold counter. He could taste the sharp, coppery tang of blood pooling in his mouth, where his teeth had sliced the inside of his cheek. "I am not resisting, sir," Elijah managed to gasp out, his voice tight, strained by the pressure on his throat, yet remarkably devoid of anger. "My identification is in my back right pocket. I am compliant. I am not a threat." But Elijah's calm wasn't a balm. To Sterling, it was an insult. The officer was accustomed to the predictable reactions of street stops, to the panic, the screaming, the erratic movements that he could easily translate into a narrative of non-compliance for his paperwork. This kid's disciplined restraint felt like a challenge to his absolute authority. It suggested the boy knew something he didn't. "Stop running your mouth," Sterling snarled. With a brutal kick, Sterling swept Elijah's legs out from under him. The teenager went down hard, the left side of his body colliding with the unyielding linoleum floor with a sickening thud that echoed through the quieted diner. Before Elijah could even draw breath to steady his ribs, Sterling dropped his full weight, driving his knee squarely into the center of the boy's spine. The air tore from Elijah's lungs in a pained, desperate wheeze. He felt his arms being violently wrenched behind his back, the ball and socket joints of his shoulders screaming in protest as they were forced past their natural range of motion. The sharp, mechanical click, click, click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheted tightly around his wrists, the metal biting deep through his skin until it met the bone. "Suspect secured," Sterling announced breathlessly, looking up at the gathered patrons with a gaze of defensive triumph. Maeve was already behind the register, her hands shaking violently as she pressed the buttons of the landline phone. Julian was being held back by Cole, tears of frustration streaming down his face as he shouted every profanity he knew. Elijah lay on the cold floor, his vision swimming with dark spots, his chest burning as he fought to expand his lungs beneath the crushing weight of the officer's knee. He closed his eyes, tuned out the shouting, and focused entirely on the rhythmic thump of his own heart. He was alive. He had survived the encounter. And now the battlefield belonged to his father. The Ridley Township Police Precinct was a squat single-story building constructed of beige cinder blocks and industrial glass, smelling perpetually of lemon floor wax, heavy winter coats, and cheap coffee. Overhead, old fluorescent tubes hummed with a relentless, high-pitched vibration that seemed to burrow directly into the skulls of anyone trapped beneath them. Elijah sat on the edge of a bolted-down wooden bench inside, holding cell number 3. The heavy steel handcuffs had been transitioned from his back to his front, allowing him to rest his forearms on his knees, but the relief was minimal. The right side of his face had swollen into a prominent, deep purple contusion that throbbed in time with his pulse. A thin, dark line of dried blood had crusted at the corner of his split lip, and his navy hoodie was torn at the seam of the shoulder, dusted with the grimy residue of the Blue Star's floor. Despite the throbbing pain and the heavy, suffocating weight of the cage, Elijah's expression remained perfectly stoic. He sat upright, his eyes fixed on the lime-green paint of the opposite wall, refusing to allow the passing patrol officers to see the fear that threatened to unravel his composure. Down the short, linoleum-lined corridor, the sound of laughter drifted through the heavy steel mesh of the intake desk. Officer Sterling was leaning against the counter, a fresh styrofoam cup of coffee cradled in his hand, recounting the evening to Sergeant Hank Grogan, a heavy-set man whose uniform shirt looked to be at its absolute structural limit. "Kid thought he was some kind of street lawyer," Sterling chuckled, shaking his head. "Gave me this creepy, robotic routine. Hands flat, yes sir, no sir. I knew right away he was hiding something. Put him down for resisting with violence, disorderly conduct, and assault on an officer. We'll let the detectives worry about sorting through the convenience store footage whenever they get around to it." Sergeant Grogan paused his typing, his fingers hovering over the ancient keyboard as he looked up, his brow furrowing with a mild, professional skepticism. "Assault on an officer, Boyd? The kid's a $140 wet. He actually swung on you?" "He braced against the counter and threw a backward elbow when I initiated the pat-down," Sterling lied smoothly, his voice never wavering. "Standard non-compliant behavior. Cole saw the whole thing, right, Jesse?" Officer Cole was standing a few feet back, his back pressed against a filing cabinet, his eyes fixed on his own mud-stained boots. The silence stretched between them for 5 agonizing seconds, a lifetime in a police station. "Jesse?" Sterling's voice lost its warmth, dropping into a low, warning register. Cole swallowed hard, the muscles in his jaw twitching as he looked up. He could see the veteran officer's eyes locking onto him, demanding the loyalty of the blue wall. He thought of his mortgage, his probationary status, and the advice his academy instructor had given him about never leaving a partner hanging on a report. "Yeah," Cole whispered, the word tasting like copper in his mouth. "Yeah, that's how it went down." Inside the cell, Elijah heard every syllable. He closed his eyes, taking a slow, shallow breath to avoid agitating his bruised ribs. He wasn't surprised by the lie. His father had prepared him for the reality that a badge could be used as a shield for a falsehood just as easily as it could be used to protect the innocent. A different officer, an older turnkey with a ring of heavy brass keys dangling from his belt, approached the bars of cell 3. He didn't look at Elijah's face. He simply held out a black plastic landline receiver through the vertical space. "You get one phone call, kid. Make it quick," the turnkey grunted. Elijah stood up slowly, the steel chains of his cuffs clinking together with a clear, metallic chime. He took the receiver with steady hands. He didn't need a phone book, nor did he need to search his memory. He dialed the 10 digits with the fluid muscle memory of a child who had practiced for an emergency since he was old enough to speak. The line rang once, twice. 12 miles away, inside the soundproofed, glass-walled conference room of the FBI's Philadelphia field office, the atmosphere was white-hot. Garrett Vance stood at the head of a 20-foot mahogany table, surrounded by 3 assistant United States attorneys and a dozen senior federal agents. The walls were lined with dry erase boards covered in financial wire diagrams, surveillance photographs, and the blueprints of a multi-state narcotics distribution network. They were currently 3 hours into a critical tactical briefing for an upcoming RICO indictment, and the stakes were measured in millions of dollars and decades of prison time. When Garrett's secure mobile device buzzed against the polished wood of the table, he glanced down automatically. The screen displayed an unlisted, local area code number. Under any ordinary circumstance, an interruption during a federal briefing of this magnitude was an unpardonable offense. But Garrett had an absolute, unbreakable rule. If his son was outside the walls of their home, every call was answered. He raised a single, large hand, instantly silencing a senior prosecutor mid-sentence. The room fell so quiet you could hear the hum of the climate control. "Vance?" he answered, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that filled the room. "Dad," the single word was whispered, but it caused the seasoned federal agent to completely vanish. In his place stood a father whose internal alarm system had just gone off with the force of an explosion. Elijah's voice wasn't just unsteady. It carried that distinct, hollow, metallic acoustic compression that Garrett had heard 10,000 times throughout his career. It was the unmistakable echo of a concrete holding facility. "Elijah, where are you?" Garrett's voice dropped an octave, the temperature in the conference room seeming to plummet 20 degrees along with it. The senior agents around the table exchanged sharp, knowing glances. They had never heard that specific tone from their commander before. "I'm at the Ridley Township Police Station," Elijah said softly, his voice catching slightly as his split lip threatened to reopen. "Dad, I didn't do anything. I was at the Blue Star with Julian. A patrol officer came in and said I matched the description of a shoplifter from down the street." Garrett's jaw clenched so tightly, the muscles along his neck stood out like iron cables. He reached for a legal pad, his movements slow, deliberate, and terrifyingly controlled. "Are you injured, son?" It wasn't an inquiry born of parental anxiety. It was a cold, precise extraction of tactical data. Elijah hesitated for a fraction of a second, wanting to protect his father from the raw reality, but he knew better than to alter a field report. "He pulled me out of the booth, Dad, slammed my face into the metal counter. Then he swept my legs and put his knee into my spine on the floor. My face is swollen, and my lip is bleeding. They just logged charges against me for felony assault on an officer and resisting arrest." The silence that followed on the line was deafening to Elijah. It felt like an endless expanse of empty space. But inside that conference room, the gathered federal officials watched a transformation that would stay with them for the rest of their careers. The civilized veneer of Special Agent Garrett Vance settled into a mask of pure, calculated, and absolute wrath. "What is the arresting officer's name, Elijah?" Garrett asked, his voice dangerously quiet, stripped of all human emotion. His name tag said Sterling, Boyd Sterling. "Did you fight back, Elijah? Did you alter your posture or speak aggressively?" "No, sir," Elijah replied instantly, his voice strengthening. "I kept my hands flat on the table. I spoke clearly. I did exactly what you taught me to do." Garrett closed his eyes for a single beat of his heart. When he opened them, the anger had been channeled into a laser-focused objective. "I know you did, son. Now listen to me very carefully. Do not utter another syllable to anyone in that building. Do not accept a glass of water. Do not answer a casual question about the weather. You sit on that bench, you look at the wall, and you wait. I am leaving the office now." "Okay, Dad." Garrett ended the call and placed the phone into his breast pocket. He looked around the table at the elite legal and law enforcement minds of the district. Slowly, calmly, he unbuttoned his charcoal suit jacket, shifting it back just enough to reveal the black polymer grip of his bureau-issued Glock 19 resting in its leather holster. He reached down to his belt, unclipped his heavy gold federal shield, and attached it to a black steel ball chain, hanging it deliberately around his neck so it rested directly over his tie. "Agent Vance, is everything all right?" asked Supervisory Special Agent Miller, breaking the heavy silence. Garrett picked up his vehicle keys from the table. "The briefing is recessed, gentlemen. A local patrolman in Ridley Township just brutalized my son and fabricated a felony record to cover his tracks." The room stiffened. Every person in that room knew Garrett's reputation. They knew his flawless record of integrity, and they knew the absolute devotion he had for the boy he was raising alone. "Do you need a tactical element, Dave?" Miller asked, already reaching toward his own badge. "No," Garrett said, his voice dropping to a temperature that felt like dry ice as he walked toward the heavy oak doors of the conference room. "But Ridley Township PD is going to need an attorney and a medic." The drive from the federal complex in downtown Philadelphia to the suburban perimeter of Ridley Township typically required 45 minutes of navigating traffic. Garrett completed the transit in 21. His dark, unmarked Chevy Suburban tore through the rain-slicked lanes of Interstate 95, its discreet LED strobe lights in the grille flashing a frantic sequence of blue and red, slicing through the Friday night congestion like a scalpel through tissue. His mind was a roaring furnace of instinctual fury, but his hands on the steering wheel were perfectly steady. He didn't know Officer Boyd Sterling, but by the time the Suburban's tires screeched across the wet asphalt of the precinct parking lot, coming to a halt diagonally across two restricted command spaces, Garrett Vance had already determined exactly how he was going to dismantle the man's life. He stepped out into the pouring rain, ignoring the downpour as he strode toward the double glass doors of the station. He didn't pause to compose himself. He struck the push bars with the full force of his momentum, the heavy doors cracking against their rubber stoppers with a sound like a gunshot. The gold shield around his neck caught the harsh, buzzing light of the lobby. The storm had arrived. The intake lobby of the Ridley Township Police Department was completely empty, save for Sergeant Hank Grogan, who was currently occupied with the remnants of his jelly donut. When the glass doors shattered against their frames, Grogan's hand froze halfway to his mouth. Garrett Vance didn't walk into the room. He occupied it. The wet fabric of his charcoal suit clung to his massive frame, and water dripped from the brim of his coat. But his presence was so intensely commanding that the desk sergeant instinctively dropped the donut onto a napkin, the sugar coating turning to paste. Grogan had spent 20 years dealing with angry parents, drunk drivers, and neighborhood lawyers, but the man standing before him carried the distinct, lethal aura of a federal operator who operated at the highest levels of state authority. "Can I help you, Agent?" Grogan asked, his voice automatically dropping its usual dismissive township cadence. Garrett didn't stop until he was inches from the heavy, scratch-resistant polycarbonate partition separating the public lobby from the secure desk. His dark eyes locked onto Grogan's with the terrifying precision of a sniper's optic. "Special Agent Garrett Vance, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Joint Terrorism Task Force," he announced, his voice a low, vibrating rumble that seemed to rattle the pens in Grogan's desk organizer. "You are currently holding a 16-year-old minor named Elijah Vance in your cells. Bring him to this desk immediately." Grogan blinked, his eyes darting down to the handwritten intake ledger on his desk. "Vance, yeah, Sterling brought a kid in 20 minutes ago. Suspect in a commercial robbery down on Kedron. Booked for resisting with violence and assault on an officer. Look, Agent Vance, I appreciate the shield, but federal status doesn't dictate local jurisdiction. The officers are still processing the initial paperwork. He's in the system." "He is my son," Garrett said. He didn't yell. The words were delivered in a deadpan, lethal whisper that carried more weight than a shout. He leaned closer to the silver speak hole in the glass. "And you are going to open that secure door and bring him out here right now, Sergeant." "Sir, I can't just release a felony suspect because his father flashes a gold badge," Grogan stammered, his hand moving with a sudden nervousness toward the intercom button, his confidence evaporating under Garrett's gaze. "Standard operating procedure requires—" "Sergeant Grogan, let me clarify the parameters of your immediate future," Garrett interrupted, his voice cutting through the sergeant's defense like a razor through silk. "I am not here requesting a professional courtesy. I am informing you that an officer under your direct command has committed a major federal civil rights violation under Title 18, United States Code, Section 242, Deprivation of Rights under Color of Law. By maintaining custody of that minor, based on a known fraudulent report, you are currently operating as an active accessory after the fact to false imprisonment and battery of a minor. Now, you can either hit that electronic buzzer and produce my son, or I can place a call directly to the United States Attorney for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania. Within 45 minutes, a federal tactical unit will secure this perimeter, seize your servers, and remove every individual in this room in federal restraints for obstruction of justice. Choose your path, Sergeant, right now." Grogan stared at the giant through the glass. He looked at the gold shield, then at the absolute, terrifying certainty in Garrett's eyes. He knew the federal government didn't play by township rules. He knew that if this man was bluffing, he was doing it with the poker face of a god. With a pale, trembling finger, Grogan reached under the lip of his desk and slammed the red manual release button. The heavy steel door to the intake corridor buzzed loudly and clicked open. I'll bring him out myself," Grogan muttered, abandoning his terminal and disappearing down the hallway. Garrett stood in the center of the empty lobby, his hands resting lightly on his hips, his jaw working in rhythmic, tense motions. Every second felt like an eternity. Then, the steel door swung open again. When Elijah stepped through the frame, Garrett's internal composure nearly fractured. His boy, the kid who still left his track medals on the kitchen counter, the kid who spent his evenings reading history books, looked incredibly small beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. The right side of Elijah's face was horribly distorted, a dark, angry hematoma spreading across his cheekbone, and his lower lip was split wide, a track of dried crimson cutting through his chin. "Dad," Elijah whispered, his voice cracking with the sudden, overwhelming relief of seeing the anchor of his life. Garrett closed the distance in 2 massive strides, pulling his son into an unyielding, protective embrace. He pressed his hand against the back of Elijah's head, holding him tight, feeling the boy's chest heave against his own. "I've got you, Elijah. I'm right here. The line holds right here." As Garrett pulled back to inspect the damage to his son's face, a loud, arrogant voice cut through the quiet of the intake corridor. "Hey, Grogan, what the hell are you doing with my collar? The paperwork isn't even logged into the terminal yet." Officer Boyd Sterling strode into the lobby, a fresh cup of station coffee balanced in his right hand, his posture radiating the smug satisfaction of a man who believed he owned the night. Officer Cole trailed half a step behind him, looking increasingly ill. Sterling stopped short when he caught sight of Garrett. He looked at the tailored suit, noted the size of the man, and then his eyes fell on the gold federal shield hanging from Garrett's neck. Sterling's smirk turned into a defensive, ugly sneer. He took a slow sip of his coffee and stepped into the public area of the lobby. "Let me guess, you're the father," Sterling said, adjusting his duty belt with his free hand. "Look, pal, I don't care if you're Bureau, Secret Service, or the director himself. Your kid committed a felony under state law tonight. He assaulted a uniformed officer during a lawful stop. He's going to the juvenile detention center in Lima, and your little tin badge isn't changing the penal code." Garrett slowly turned his back on his son, shielding Elijah behind his massive frame. The warmth he had shown his boy vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, predatory focus. He stepped toward Sterling, his movements fluid and unhurried, invading the patrolman's personal space until he was standing a mere 2 inches from the officer's chest. Garrett had 3 inches of height and 50 pounds of muscle on the township cop, and the psychological weight of his presence was suffocating. "You are Officer Boyd Sterling," Garrett stated. It wasn't a question, it was a formal notation for the record. "Yeah, that's right. And you're interfering with an active police investigation," Sterling shot back, though his voice rose an octave as he instinctively took a half-step backward to preserve his perimeter. "I am the investigation," Garrett replied, his voice dropping into a quiet, rhythmic cadence that carried the chill of a tomb. "You detained my son under the pretense that he matched the physical description of a suspect involved in a strong-armed robbery at the convenience store on Kedron Avenue, correct?" "He matched the description perfectly. Navy hoodie, jeans, fled on foot," Sterling said, trying to regain his footing. "Fascinating investigative work, Officer Sterling," Garrett said, his voice dripping with an icy, academic sarcasm. "Except for one rather glaring chronological impossibility in your narrative. While I was traveling down the interstate, I had my field office pull the regional digital dispatch logs for this township." Garrett reached into his suit jacket, pulled out his encrypted smartphone, and held the screen directly in front of Sterling's face. "According to the Ridley Township CAD server, you logged my son's arrest from the Blue Star Diner at exactly 8:23 p.m., Garrett continued, his finger tapping the digital timestamp. "However, the initial 911 call from the store clerk reporting the shoplifting incident wasn't received by your own dispatch center until 8:28 p.m. That is a 5-minute discrepancy, Officer Sterling." The color drained from Sterling's face so fast it looked as though he had been struck. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. The styrofoam cup in his hand began to tremble, the dark liquid rippling against the rim. "Care to explain to me for the record," Garrett whispered, leaning down so his lips were inches from Sterling's ear, "how my son managed to travel 5 minutes into the future, commit a commercial misdemeanor, return to the past, sit back down in a diner booth, and allow you to assault him?" Officer Cole let out a soft, involuntary gasp from the corner, his face turning a ghostly shade of white as he stepped back from his partner, as if Sterling had suddenly become radioactive. It was a data entry error by dispatch," Sterling stammered, the bravado completely vanishing, replaced by the desperate, frantic movements of a cornered animal. "The kid was acting suspicious. He was uncooperative. He braced against the counter and elbowed me when I attempted a physical search. I had lawful grounds to execute a use of force." "He elbowed you?" Garrett repeated flatly. He shifted his gaze away from Sterling, his piercing eyes locking onto the rookie officer standing in the corner. Is that what happened, Officer Cole? Did my 16-year-old son, who tracks at 140 pounds, physically assault a 210-pound veteran officer inside a crowded establishment? Cole swallowed hard, his throat dry, his eyes darting from Sterling's desperate stare to Elijah's shattered face, and finally landing on the gold federal shield around Garrett's neck. Think very carefully about your next syllable, son, Garrett warned Cole, his tone carrying an absolute, unyielding weight of consequence. Because providing a false statement to a federal agent during the course of an active civil rights investigation is a felony under Title 18, Section 1001. It carries a mandatory stay in a federal penitentiary. There is no blue wall in a federal facility, Officer Cole. Did my son assault your partner? The silence inside the intake lobby was total. The only sound was the frantic patter of the autumn rain against the glass doors. Cole closed his eyes, his shoulders slumping as the weight of his uniform became too heavy to bear. No, sir, the rookie whispered, his voice cracking with shame. He didn't do anything. He was just eating his food. Boyd just grabbed him from the booth. There was no elbow. Shut your mouth, Cole, Sterling roared, turning violently toward his partner, his fist clenching. You sniveling little coward, you're going to rat on your own. Sterling never finished the threat. With blinding explosive speed, Garrett's hand shot forward, his fingers locking into the heavy tactical nylon of Sterling's ballistic vest. With one fluid, massive surge of power, Garrett lifted the officer off his feet and slammed him backward into the beige cinder block wall. The styrofoam cup exploded against the floor, splattering hot coffee across the linoleum. Sterling grunted heavily, the air driven completely from his lungs as Garrett pinned him against the concrete, his face inches from the disgraced cops. You speak to that witness again, and I will add federal witness intimidation to your indictment, Garrett snarled, the civilized veneer completely fracturing to reveal the terrifying predator beneath. You put your hands on my boy. You drew blood from my son. You are an absolute stain on that uniform. And before the sun rises over this county, I am going to ensure you never wear a piece of state leather again. What the hell is happening in my lobby? The booming voice descended from the iron staircase leading to the executive offices. Chief Thomas McInnes, a heavy-set man with a thick, white handlebar mustache, and the tired, bloodshot eyes of a bureaucrat who was 3 years away from a state pension, hurried into the room. He had been upstairs reviewing municipal budgets when the shouting started. McInnes froze mid-step, his eyes widening as he witnessed an FBI special agent holding one of his senior patrolmen 3 inches off the floor by his vest. Chief, get this maniac off me, Sterling gasped, his hands clawing uselessly at Garrett's iron wrists. He's assaulting an officer. Garrett didn't let go immediately. He maintained his grip for 3 long, terrifying seconds, forcing Sterling to look directly into the void of his career's end before releasing him with a gesture of profound disgust. Sterling slid down the wall, coughing as he adjusted his uniform. Garrett turned to face the police chief, calmly reaching down to smooth the lapels of his wetsuit jacket. Chief McInnes, Garrett said, his voice instantly returning to its terrifying, cold equilibrium. I am Special Agent Garrett Vance. This man, he pointed a rigid, trembling finger at Sterling, violently assaulted my minor son inside the Blue Star Diner, falsified a criminal complaint to justify the brutality, and forced his rookie partner to corroborate the lie. Your rookie has just provided a full confession to the conspiracy. McInnes looked from the imposing federal agent to the swollen, bruised face of the teenager standing by the bench, then to Sterling, who was avoiding his gaze, and finally to Cole, who was visibly weeping. A massive throbbing ache began to form behind the chief's eyes. He knew exactly who Garrett Vance was. The man was a legend in the Eastern District for his relentless, clinical prosecutions of municipal corruption. Agent Vance, McInnes began, raising his hands in a defensive, placating gesture. Let's everyone take a breath. If Officer Sterling exceeded his authority, I assure you, our Internal Affairs Division will handle this strictly by the administrative book. We will expunge the intake log immediately, get your son checked out by our township EMS, and Internal Affairs? Garrett let out a short, hollow laugh that sent a physical chill through the room. Chief, we are light years past an internal review. This isn't a violation of your department's grooming policy. This is a federal civil rights prosecution. Garrett reached into his pocket and produced his phone once more. While I was en route, my office contacted Maeve Reynolds at the Blue Star. She granted federal authorities immediate, remote access to their cloud-based high-definition surveillance server. Would you like to see what your officer did at 8:23 p.m. tonight? Sterling's face turned the color of ash. Chief, you can't look at that. He's biasing the record. Shut up, Boyd, McInnes snapped, his own chest tightening with a deep, professional dread. He walked over to Garrett and looked down at the digital screen. Garrett pressed play. The 1080p footage was utterly undeniable. It showed Elijah sitting peacefully in the corner booth, his hands opening and pressing flat against the table the moment the officers arrived. It captured the total absence of provocation. And then it showed the raw, unadulterated violence, Sterling yanking the boy by the throat, the brutal launch into the steel counter, and the sickening drop of his knee into the spine of an unresisting child. McInnes watched the loop twice. He closed his eyes, rubbing his temples as he realized his department's insurance premium, reputation, and potentially his own career were crumbling in real time. As you can see, Chief, Garrett said, sliding the phone back into his pocket. There was no robbery suspect. There was no resistance. There was only a predator with a badge looking for a victim he thought didn't have a voice. He chose the wrong kid. I thought he was reaching for a weapon, Sterling attempted to lie, his voice cracking pathetically as he looked around the room. He went toward his waistband. The video shows his hands flat on the formica. Officer Sterling, Garrett said, with absolute contempt. Assistant United States Attorney Mitchell will enjoy playing that frame by frame for a federal grand jury. Garrett turned his back on Sterling completely, addressing the chief. Chief McInnes, you have a tactical decision to make in the next 60 seconds. You can either arrest this man for aggravated assault and official oppression under state law right now, or I can walk out to my vehicle, retrieve my federal constraints, and execute the arrest myself under Title 18. Either way, Boyd Sterling is leaving this facility in steel. How does your department want to be remembered in the morning news cycle? McInnes didn't hesitate. The survival instinct of a career bureaucrat took over completely. He turned toward the intake desk. Grogan, get me a set of transport cuffs. Sterling stepped back, absolute panic finally breaking through his crust of arrogance. Chief, you can't be serious. I've been on this force for 10 years. I've taken paper for this town. You're going to take the word of some fed over your own guy? I'm taking the word of the camera, Boyd, McInnes said heavily, snatching the heavy steel cuffs from Grogan's hand. Turn around and face the wall. Put your hands behind your back. As Sterling slowly turned, his shoulders slumping as the fight evaporated from his frame, the crisp, distinct click, click, click of the cuffs echoed through the room. It was a poetic, identical mirror to the sound Elijah had endured on the diner floor an hour prior. Boyd Sterling, you are under arrest, McInnes began, his voice flat and monotone as he recited the Miranda warnings. Garrett didn't stay to listen to the rights of the man who had discarded his sons. He turned toward Elijah, placing a large, gentle hand on his uninjured shoulder. Are we finished here, Dad? Elijah asked softly, the exhaustion finally breaking through his stoic defense. We're finished, son. Let's go home. Garrett guided Elijah out of the sterile, suffocating air of the precinct and into the cool, dark autumn night. The heavy downpour had passed, leaving behind a crisp, cleansing breeze that swept the fog from the avenue. They walked in silence to the large black SUV. Garrett opened the passenger door for his son, a quiet gesture of profound respect. Once they were both inside, the heavy door sealing them into the quiet hum of the idling V8 engine, the adrenaline began its slow, painful retreat. Elijah leaned his head back against the leather headrest, wincing slightly as the swollen side of his face made contact with the material. Garrett looked over at his boy, his hands gripping the leather-wrapped steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. "I have never been more proud of you in my life, Elijah," Garrett said, his voice thick with a raw, rare emotion. "You did everything right. You stayed within the protocol. You survived. I am so deeply sorry you had to endure that. But you handled yourself like a man who knows his worth." Elijah turned his head slowly, a small, painful smile touching his uninjured lip. "I had a master class instructor, Dad." Garrett reached out, his massive hand squeezing Elijah's shoulder, holding him to the earth. The judicial battle was just beginning. There would be civil depositions, federal hearings, and a media storm in the days to come. The United States Attorney's Office would ensure Boyd Sterling spent the better part of the next decade inside a federal corrections facility. But tonight, as Garrett shifted the vehicle into drive and pulled away from the flashing lights of the precinct, the only metric that mattered was that his son was sitting in the seat beside him, moving forward into the light. The morning after the arrest, the quiet suburban streets of Ridley Township were introduced to the absolute chaos of a modern media firestorm. The high-definition surveillance footage from the Blue Star Diner had been formally subpoenaed by the United States Attorney's Office, but an anonymous clerk within the county courthouse had leaked the file to a Philadelphia news affiliate before the ink on the warrant was dry. By noon, the manicured grass lawn outside the Ridley Township Police Department was choked with satellite vans, heavy camera tripods, and reporters standing in the damp October wind. The video was a cultural earthquake. The image of a disciplined, silent teenager holding his hands flat on a table before being violently launched into a stainless steel counter was undeniable in its brutality. Boyd Sterling, suspended indefinitely without pay and released on a $50,000 corporate bond, was a man who had built his life on dominance, and he had no intention of vanishing quietly. Within 48 hours, he had retained the services of Carlton Thorne. Thorne was a high-priced, notorious defense attorney from Philadelphia, whose entire business model revolved around defending law enforcement officers accused of brutality by systematic character assassination of their victims. On Monday afternoon, Thorne stood before a bank of microphones in a downtown hotel ballroom, projecting an image of righteous indignation. "My client is a decorated 10-year veteran who was forced to make a split-second decision in a high-crime corridor based on a valid dispatch report," Thorne announced, slamming his hand against the podium. "We have information suggesting the individual in question was uncooperative, exhibited deceptive physical behavior, and provoked a necessary compliance hold. This is a classic case of federal overreach, designed to destroy a local hero's life for political points." But Special Agent Garrett Vance did not operate in the emotional arena of press conferences. He operated in the cold, unyielding world of evidence. He knew men like Boyd Sterling. He knew that an officer who possessed the brazen arrogance to brutalize a child in a crowded public diner and then force a rookie partner to sign off on a felony fabrication had not arrived at that level of depravity overnight. This was the behavior of an individual who had been operating with absolute impunity for a very long time. Garrett formally requested a temporary reassignment from his counterterrorism duties, partnering with Special Agent Brooke Daniels from the Bureau's Public Corruption Unit. Daniels was a brilliant forensic investigator who possessed the unique ability to read financial ledgers the way a tracker read broken twigs in the forest. By the second week of November, the two agents had established a secure working space on the third floor of the Philadelphia field office. The walls were no longer covered in international threat matrices. Instead, they were lined with Sterling's bank records, tax returns, and 10 years of historical township dispatch logs. Look at the delta right here, Garrett, Daniels said, circling a line on a spreadsheet with a red dry erase marker. Sterling's base municipal salary is $65,000 a year. Yet, according to his divorce decrees, he's been paying $4,000 a month in cash alimony to his ex-wife for the last 3 years. He drives a $80,000 heavy-duty pickup, and our property checks show he just put a $20,000 cash down payment on a lake house in the Poconos. The math isn't just broken, it's a work of fiction. Garrett stood with his arms crossed over his chest, his eyes tracing a map of Ridley Township that had been pinned to the center of the board. Red pushpins marked the locations of every street stop Sterling had executed over the past 24 months. He isn't making this money on overtime, Brooke, Garrett said, his voice low and analytical. Look at the business clusters where he spends his unassigned patrol hours. They aren't high-crime residential areas. They're cash-heavy commercial operations, independent auto bays, small bodegas, and 24-hour diners. Garrett's eyes stopped on a small blue dot marking the location of the Blue Star Diner. A cold, heavy weight settled into his stomach. The realization didn't come as a flash of insight. It arrived with the sickening weight of an absolute certainty. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and dialed Maeve Reynolds directly. "Maeve, it's Agent Vance," he said, when the line connected. "I am standing in our command center, looking at Officer Sterling's historical patrol patterns. I need you to listen to me very carefully, and I need the absolute truth. Did Boyd Sterling ever demand cash payments from you?" The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the sound of Maeve's ragged breathing over the cellular connection. When she finally spoke, her voice was stripped of its usual diner grit, reduced to a trembling, frightened whisper. "He called it a municipal security assessment, Garrett," Maeve sobbed, the tears evident in her voice. $500 a month, in an unsealed envelope left in the employee office on the first of every month. He told me if I paid, he'd keep the vagrants and the truck drunks out of my parking lot. He said if I ever missed a cycle, his shift would start executing vehicle stops on every single customer leaving my property. He said he'd make my business a living hell until the bank foreclosed. Garrett's hand gripped the phone until his knuckles turned white. "How long, Maeve?" 2 years, Garrett. I paid him every single month. But with food costs going up this autumn, the diner was barely breaking even. Last month, I told him I couldn't make the drop. I told him I didn't have the cash. "The night Elijah was arrested," Garrett said, the pieces of the puzzle violently locking together in his mind. "There was no robbery suspect." "No," Maeve wept. "He wasn't looking for a thief, Garrett. He was sending me a message. He chose the most vulnerable kid in the room, a boy he thought had nobody looking out for him, and he broke him right in front of my counter to show me what happens when his money stops. Your son was just a prop to him." Garrett ended the call slowly, placing the device on the desk. The anger that filled him wasn't the hot, reactive rage of the diner floor. It was something far more dangerous. It was a cold, institutional determination. Elijah hadn't just been the victim of an aggressive, profiling patrolman. His boy had been treated as collateral damage in a mob-style commercial extortion racket operated by an individual who wore the authority of the state on his chest. The following morning, Garrett and Daniels located Officer Jesse Cole. They didn't approach him at the precinct, where the blue wall could protect him. They caught him at a small, isolated park near his apartment in Delaware County. Cole looked hollowed out. He had lost 15 pounds, the dark circles under his eyes suggesting he hadn't slept since the night he chose truth over loyalty. "Officer Cole," Daniels said, presenting her credentials as they stepped into his path on the gravel walkway. "We've completed our forensic review of Boyd Sterling's financial footprint. We know about the envelopes from the Blue Star Diner. We know about the extortion scheme across the commercial corridor." Cole closed his eyes, leaning his head back against a concrete light pole. "I didn't take a dime, agents. I swear to God on my mother's life. I didn't know about the money until 2 months ago." "It doesn't matter what you took, Jesse," Garrett said, his voice dropping into a stern, paternal frequency that cut through the rookie's panic. "You were in the vehicle when the drops were made. You signed off on patrol logs that faked suspicious activity to justify stops on non-compliant businesses. Under the Federal Penal Code, that makes you an active participant in a conspiracy under the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. You are looking at a 20-year statutory maximum in a federal prison." Cole collapsed onto a wooden park bench, burying his face in his hands, his chest heaving as he began to weep openly. "He told me it was just how things were done out here, Agent Vance. He said every small town had a grease tax. He told me if I ever wrote a memo to Internal Affairs, he'd plant a bag of narcotics in my personal locker and have me processed out before the union could even assign a rep. He said he'd destroy my life." "He can't protect you anymore, Jesse," Garrett said, stepping closer and placing a hand on the rookie's trembling shoulder. "But the United States Attorney is willing to offer you a formal immunity agreement from prosecution. We need the records. We need to know where the money went." Cole wiped his face, his eyes filling with a sudden, desperate resolve. "It's not just Boyd, Agent Vance. He wasn't smart enough to set this up alone. I have a ledger in my apartment, dates, times, and drop-offs. I kept it because I was terrified this day would come. If I give it to you, you have to promise me you'll go all the way to the top." Garrett looked toward the horizon, his jaw set. "Jesse, you have no idea how high I'm prepared to climb." The federal machinery moved with a silent, terrifying velocity once the foundation of a conspiracy was exposed. Within 48 hours of Officer Jesse Cole's cooperation, the forensic accountants of the FBI had unraveled a network that extended far beyond the pockets of a single corrupt patrolman. Boyd Sterling was currently sitting in a segregation cell at the United States Penitentiary in Lewisburg, his defense attorney's public relations campaign thoroughly neutralized by the mounting federal evidence. But Garrett Vance was a veteran who understood that a poison stream is never cleared by simply capturing a single drop of water. It was a cold Tuesday evening in late November when Special Agent Brooke Daniels entered Garrett's office, shutting the heavy wooden door behind her. She carried a thick, blue, expanding folder that bore the red stamp of the Department of Justice Asset Forfeiture Division. "The financial tracking is complete, Garrett," Daniels said, setting the file directly under his desk lamp. "We traced the corporate shell company Sterling was utilizing to launder the cash from the diner and the auto shops. It's an LLC registered in Delaware called Keystone Security Consulting." Garrett didn't open the folder immediately. He leaned back in his leather chair, his fingers interlaced. "Let me guess, Brooke. Boyd Sterling's name isn't on the incorporation documents." "Not even close," Daniels said, leaning forward and tapping a highlighted line of text on the asset sheet. "The LLC is wholly owned by a blind trust fund managed by a real estate attorney in Chester. The sole beneficiary of that trust? A man named Peter Gallagher. Gallagher is the biological brother-in-law of Ridley Township Police Chief Thomas McInnes." A profound, freezing silence filled the office. Garrett looked out the window at the distant lights of the city. He thought back to the night at the precinct, to the way Chief McInnes had hurried down the stairs, his apparent indignation at Sterling's behavior, and his immediate haste to execute the arrest once the surveillance video was presented. At the time, it had looked like the decisive action of a responsible administrator managing a crisis. Now, Garrett realized it was the frantic, calculated desperation of a criminal cutting off a compromised limb to protect the rest of the organism. "McInnes wasn't trying to enforce the law that night," Garrett said, his voice dropping into a deadly, flat register. "He was executing a cleanup operation. He sacrificed Sterling to ensure we never looked at the rest of the ledger. According to the bank records we subpoenaed this morning," Daniels continued, "Sterling was only keeping 40% of the extortion money. The remaining 60% was transferred electronically every Friday morning into Keystone Security's account. Chief McInnes has been clearing nearly $9,000 a month in illicit cash for the last 5 years. Garrett stood up, reaching for his shoulder holster and adjusting the Glock 19 beneath his arm. He grabbed his heavy wool overcoat from the brass rack behind his door. "Get Assistant United States Attorney Mitchell on the secure line," Garrett commanded, his eyes turning to Flint. "Tell him we need a federal arrest warrant for Thomas McInnes signed within 20 minutes. Then notify the field office tactical team. We need to coordinate with the county sheriff's department for a local surrender," Daniels suggested, reaching for her phone. "No," Garrett said coldly, pulling his coat on. McInnes announced his early retirement to the township board yesterday afternoon. "Our surveillance team indicates he's currently packing his personal effects into boxes in his office. I think it's time we throw the chief a proper federal retirement party." An hour later, a convoy of 4 unmarked black Chevrolet Suburbans rolled silently into the rear municipal parking lot of the Ridley Township Police Department. There were no sirens, no flashing lights, and no theatrical announcements. The operation moved with the clinical, silent precision of a federal raid. Chief Thomas McInnes was standing behind his large mahogany desk, carefully wrapping a framed silver photograph of his cabin cruiser in bubble wrap. When the heavy oak door to his office swung open without a knock, he looked up, an expression of annoyance forming on his face as he expected to see a local lieutenant. But the words died in his throat when Garrett Vance stepped into the room. Garrett was flanked by Agent Daniels and 2 heavily armed FBI tactical operators wearing full ballistic gear, their M4 carbines held at the low ready, the yellow letters FBI Stark against their black vests. "Agent Vance," McInnes stammered, the bubble wrap slipping from his fingers and landing with a soft rustle on the carpet. What is the meaning of this? As I informed your field office, I have turned over every document related to the Boyd Sterling investigation. I am officially retired as of 5 o'clock today." "This isn't about Sterling, Tom," Garrett said. He didn't raise his voice. He stood in the center of the office, his hands clasped behind his back, projecting an absolute, unyielding institutional authority that made the room feel incredibly small. "This is about Keystone Security Consulting LLC and the $9,000 your brother-in-law has been routing into your offshore account every month." McInnes's knees buckled slightly. He reached out with both hands, gripping the edge of his mahogany desk to steady his frame, his face transforming into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. I don't have any knowledge of that entity. That's a private family matter." "Save the narrative for the federal magistrate," Agent Daniels said, stepping forward and dropping a multi-page document onto the center of the desk. "Thomas McInnes, you are under arrest pursuant to a federal warrant issued by the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania. The charges are conspiracy to commit extortion under color of official right, wire fraud, and active violations of the RICO Act." As the tactical operators moved in, their gloved hands efficiently securing McInnes's wrists behind his back with heavy steel cuffs, Garrett walked over to the large bay window overlooking the streets of Ridley Township. Below, the citizens were going about their evening, parents driving home from work, teenagers walking into the convenience stores, local business owners turning on their neon signs. They were entirely unaware that the very administrative structure that had sworn to protect them from the darkness had been systematically bleeding them dry from behind closed doors. By nightfall, the Department of Justice issued a sweeping press release announcing a federal consent decree, effectively stripping the Ridley Township Police Department of its autonomous status and placing the entire municipal force under direct federal oversight. The mayor held a frantic televised press conference promising systemic reforms, but the community knew the truth. The rot hadn't been discovered by internal mechanisms. It had been dug out by its absolute roots because a corrupt cop had made the fatal mistake of putting his hands on the son of a federal operator. The late May sun brought a fierce, humid heat to central Pennsylvania, turning the blue skies over Shippensburg University into a shimmering haze. The grandstands of the university stadium were packed to absolute capacity with thousands of roaring spectators, college scouts tracking talent with stopwatches, and high school students waving school banners. It was the final day of the Pennsylvania State Track and Field Championships, and the air was thick with the scent of hot track rubber, liniment oil, and the intense competitive electricity of elite athletics. Down on the bright red synthetic surface of the infield, 16-year-old Elijah Vance was deep within his pre-race preparation. He was performing a sequence of high knee extensions, his dark, muscular legs moving with a fluid, metronomic efficiency. The heavy purple contusions that had distorted his face 6 months ago were completely gone, leaving his skin smooth and unmarred. But the internal reconstruction had required a far more arduous path. For months after the incident at the Blue Star, Elijah had lived within the quiet prison of trauma. He had flinched at the sudden sound of municipal sirens. He had experienced a suffocating, heavy anxiety whenever he entered a public space where his back was turned to the door. But out here, within the white chalk lines of the running lanes, Elijah had found his sanctuary. On the track, there was no administrative profiling, no systemic corruption, and no injustice. There was only the gun, the lane, and the clock. Julian Cross walked over from the team bench, tossing a cold bottle of water toward Elijah's chest. Julian was running the third leg of their 4x100-meter relay team, and his pale face suggested he was currently battling a severe case of competitive nausea. "You good, El?" Julian asked, wiping a layer of sweat from his forehead with the back of his jersey. "Those guys from North Allegheny look like they were built in a state laboratory. The anchor leg guy looks like he eats raw iron for breakfast." Elijah caught the bottle smoothly, a genuine, easy laugh breaking across his features, a sound that carried the absolute liberation of a kid who had reclaimed his youth. "Let them eat whatever they want, Julian. Your only job is to survive the curve and get that aluminum baton into my left hand. I'll handle the rest of the landscape." Up in the concrete bleachers, positioned a few rows back from the stadium's finish line, Garrett Vance watched his son through a pair of dark sunglasses. He was dressed casually in a navy polo shirt and denim jeans, his large frame blending into the crowd of proud parents. To the spectators around him, he was simply another father spending his weekend supporting his child. He carried no shield around his neck today, no tactical operators at his back. He had fought the battle in the courts, secured the indictments, and cleared the field. Today, his only assignment was to bear witness to his son's triumph. "Runners, take your marks for the final of the men's 4x100-meter relay," the stadium announcer's voice boomed over the massive loudspeakers. Garrett leaned forward, his hands gripping the aluminum railing in front of him, his heart hammering against his ribs with a force that no federal raid had ever induced. Down on the track, the starting gun cracked with a sharp, echoing report. The race erupted into a blur of motion. The first 2 legs were a brutal, high-stakes dogfight, with 4 school teams running neck and neck down the back straightaway. As the runners hit the final turn, Ridley High was trailing in a distant third place, nearly 4 meters behind the powerhouse team from North Allegheny. But Julian Cross ran the curve of his life. His lanky, uncoordinated legs pumped with a furious, desperate energy, closing the distance foot by foot until he reached the exchange zone. With a final lunging extension, he thrust the silver aluminum baton squarely into Elijah's waiting palm. The moment Elijah's fingers locked around the metal, something shifted within his posture. All the lingering shadows of the past 6 months, the terror of the diner floor, the cold steel of the handcuffs, the humiliation of the holding cell, were completely converted into a raw, explosive physical energy. He didn't merely accelerate, he launched himself down the straightaway like a projectile. The crowd in the grandstands rose to their feet with a collective, roaring surge of sound as Elijah began to close the gap. "Come on, Elijah, drive!" Garrett roared from the railing, his voice cutting through the stadium noise like a foghorn. "Go! Elijah passed the runner from Central Bucks within the first 30 meters, his form a flawless exhibition of athletic symmetry, his shoulders square, his breathing perfectly synchronized, his eyes locked dead onto the white line of the finish. With 50 meters remaining, he pulled even with the anchor from North Allegheny. The two boys ran stride for stride, their spikes tearing into the rubber track, their chests straining against the heat. But Elijah possessed something his opponent did not, a deep, unyielding well of resilience that had been forged in the fire of real-world survival. With a final agonizing surge of power, Elijah threw his chest forward, crossing the finish line a mere fraction of a second before his rival. The stadium erupted into a wall of sound. Julian tackled Elijah from behind, sending both boys sliding across the high jump mats in a chaotic, laughing tangle of limbs and school jerseys. When Elijah finally extracted himself from his celebrating teammates, he stood up and looked directly into the sea of faces in the grandstands. His eyes scanned the concrete rows until they locked onto his father. Garrett was standing by the railing, his sunglasses removed, tears openly tracing paths down his granite face. He raised his right hand to the temple of his brow, executing a slow, deliberate, and deeply respectful salute to the boy he had raised. Elijah smiled back, a bright, unbroken expression that illuminated the infield, and tapped his fist twice over his heart. The system had attempted to crush Elijah Vance. A corrupt badge had tried to steal his dignity, and a broken department had tried to compromise his future. But they had failed completely. He had survived the encounter. His father had brought the darkness into the absolute light of justice, and together they had held the line. As Elijah walked toward the podium to receive his state medal, the afternoon sun cast a long golden shadow behind him on the track. The scars of the past would always remain a chapter of his narrative, but they would never dictate his destination. He was moving forward at a velocity that nobody could ever hold down again. The story of Garrett and Elijah Vance reminds us of a profound, universal truth. In a world that can sometimes feel cold, unjust, and overwhelming, the fiercest shield we possess is the unyielding bond of family. True justice isn't just about the laws written in books. It's about the quiet promises we keep to the ones we love, to stand by them in their darkest hours, to bring their pain into the light, and to fight for their dignity when their own voices are stripped away. Elijah survived his storm not just because he was strong, but because he knew he didn't have to carry the weight of the world alone. Life will test us, and systems may fail us, but a father's love, built on fierce protection and deep respect, is a force that can dismantle any darkness. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this story. Have you ever had a moment where family was your ultimate anchor in a storm? Drop your story in the comments below. We read every single one. And if this journey resonated with your heart, please consider subscribing to the channel. Let's keep standing for the stories that truly matter together.